This series of history presentations is intended to establish the connections between various elements of history and how poverty works right down to the present day. And one of the factors that's most important is the role of labor. That means organized labor unions, and we have to look at their effect on poverty. Now, this chart is a listing of some of the more important labor-related events in American history. I want to go through these one by one and talk about their importance. Let's go back to the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This was intended to keep corporations from banding together and controlling the market, setting prices, and setting the conditions of commerce in ways that would inhibit the free market. But one of the nasty aspects of this was that it was applied more to labor unions than to corporations. Workers were accused of violating the Antitrust Act by combining together. The court said was a restraint of trade. In other words, they were banding together to eliminate free trade. Now the thing is, the playing field was not even at all. Corporations could do that, but workers, individual workers, were being denied the right to band together to bargain collectively, to bargain as a group for better wages and working conditions. Now, this was corrected during the Progressive Era with the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, and that specifically says that labor unions now are not charged with antitrust violations for their activities in the courts. And this was a move in favor of the development of labor unions. And look at the red line here. It starts to go up. The red line represents the numbers of union members. The blue line represents the percentage of the national income that is controlled by the top 1% of the population. Now you'll see here the red line starts to go up. Unions start to get stronger as a result of the Clayton Act. Now, let's be the National War Labor Board. This is a World War I law that realized that if the United States was going to be successful in the war effort, that labor and management had to work together. And in order to do this, they gave certain rights to workers. And this strengthened labor unions. And look again, the numbers of union members goes up during the World War I period. Now that would change though if you look at that slight decline after the war in the 1920s when corporations gained the upper hand. Now let's go to the milestone on this list, and that was the Wall Street crash, when the stock market tanked. And you'll see here that because so many of the top 1% had so much money invested in the stock market that their share of the national income started to go down. But shortly after the Wall Street crash, that did not mean that labor unions gained because unemployment was so high that employers could simply fire workers and they were at their mercy because jobs were so scarce. Now that starts to turn around in the 30s with a couple of laws. The National Industrial Recovery Act, which actually was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but the more important of the two was the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. That's also known as the Wagner Act. And this was one of the landmark pieces of legislation under Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal that guaranteed the rights of workers to organize. So let's break away from this chart for a moment and take a look at what that law did. This all happened under FDR. He was the president in all of our history who was most friendly to the rights of workers. Now, in this law, 1935 law that I just talked about, what it does is allow workers to unionize. It guarantees that right. It established a group called the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB. And if 30% of workers in a bargaining unit signed union cards, in other words, they signed a card that said, we would like blank to represent us as a union, maybe the United Auto Workers or the United Mine Workers or whatever, then there would be an election. And the National Labor Relations Board would supervise the election. Not the company, not the union, but this federal agency would do it. And if there was a simple majority in that election in favor of the union, then that union was established as the bargaining agent for that employer. That's called recognition, that the employer must recognize the union as the representative of the workers in that bargaining unit. And they are required to negotiate in good faith with that union. That was an enormous boost to the union movement in the United States. Now, 3 years later, there was another very, very important law called the Fair Labor Standards Act. It established a 40-hour week, something that the labor movement had been working for decades. And if they were asked to work more than 40 hours, they were entitled to time and a half for any overtime that exceeded 40 hours, at least in many categories of jobs. It established the first national minimum wage, which was at that time 25 cents an hour, which would be $4 and change in today's money. That's not a lot, but it was a foot in the door. It also controlled child labor. It helped to restrict it. The Congress had tried that in 1916, and that was shot down by the Supreme Court. But by now, the Supreme Court had undergone a transformation with some of Roosevelt's appointees, and this time, in 1941, when it came up again, the controls on child labor were upheld by the Supreme Court. I would encourage you to take a look at some of the effects of this law, the Wagner Act, on one of the most famous labor controversies in our history, and that would be the Flint sit-down strike of 1936-37. If you go to the PDF version of this presentation, you can get a link to that. It's only a minute or so long. Now let's go back to this chart here. The next milestone that is pointed out here is one that's hostile to labor. This was passed by a Republican Congress in the late 1940s, the Taft-Hartley Act. Organized labor has tried to get this repealed ever since, but has not been successful. What that did was to outlaw what's called the closed shop. This was something that had been negotiated by unions to require that workers had to belong to a union to be hired by that company. It also allowed the president to obtain an injunction against a strike. If he decided that it was against the national interest, he could do that. It also forbade secondary boycotts. For example, if you're boycotting a company, can you also boycott the stores that sell that company's products? And the answer to that is no now, because that is called a secondary boycott. Now the next item I want to highlight here is a Supreme Court decision in 1976. Buckley versus Vallejo. It's about campaign contributions. It said you can limit individual campaign contributions, but independent groups can contribute unlimited amounts of money to political campaigns, and also individuals running for office can use as much of their own money as they want to promote their own campaigns, which becomes an issue when you have incredibly wealthy people like Michael Bloomberg or Donald Trump. And this is one of the things that increases the power of the 1% over American politics. Now look at that blue line here. It goes up after this decision. That means that the percent of the national income that goes to the top 1% is going up. Okay, now look at milestone here, and that is the election and inauguration of Ronald Reagan. He was elected in 1980, took office in January of 1981. Among other things, he fired the air traffic controllers who had gone on strike, and he made that stick, and that was a major blow against unions' rights to organize and to strike. He also was able to appoint members to the National Labor Relations Board, and he appointed members who were hostile to the rights of unions to organize, and how they define their bargaining unit, etc., things like that. Now look what happens. The share of union members begins to go down pretty dramatically after the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, and the percent of the national income that goes to the top 1% starts to go up. Now let's look at the last of these events here, and that would be what was called the Contract with America. Bill Clinton, kind of a moderate Democrat, was elected in 1992, but 2 years later, the Republicans made major gains in the midterm elections, the congressional elections of that year, and the Speaker of the House was Newt Gingrich at the time, and he issued something called the Contract with America. This was a conservative manifesto. It was, generally speaking, hostile to labor unions, against regulations on corporations, for lower taxes. It was a whole long list of conservative priorities. And look what happens after that. The share of the labor market, the workforce that is unionized, continues to go down, and the top 1%'s share of the national income continues to go up. Now let's look at some other data here. Union membership rates have undergone a long decline. If you look at the peak there, it's at the end of World War II in 1945, when about 35% of all American workers were unionized. And then there's been a long decline in that, so that by 2012, and this has continued, I don't have a graph that shows more recent data, but by 2012 it was down to about 11.3% of all workers, and of the private sector it was down to 6.6%. The reason for the difference is that you have a better chance to remain unionized if you're a public employee, you work for a federal or state government, than if you work for private companies. Now this trend, as I said, has only continued since then. The total share of unionized workers is 10% and change right down to the present day. Now look at this chart. It's interesting. Union membership goes down. That's represented by the red line. And the share of the income, the national income that goes to the middle class, also goes down. There's a rough parallel between the decline in union members and the share of the income that goes to the middle class. Now let's take a look at what CEOs, chief executive officers of corporations, are getting, what they're paid. Up until about 1980, it was somewhere in the range of 25, 30%, 30 times what their average worker was making. Now that's a lot. That's a big difference. If an average worker were making $20,000, for example, 30 times that would be $600,000. That's a huge difference. But then look what happens after that. Again, with the era of Reagan, it skyrockets, and it goes up to between 250 and 300% or more. The rate now, I believe, is something like 340%. Not percent, but 340 times what the average worker is making. That's an enormous difference. And that contributes to the gap between rich and poor. Now let's look at the hourly earnings growth corrected for inflation of production workers, non-supervisory workers. You can see that the trend is downward. And the growth has not been very dramatic, even when the economy was doing better. And the result today is that the average worker working a blue-collar job is not really making enough to support a household. Now let's look at one other bit of evidence here. Productivity is defined as the ratio between the output in dollars and the amount of hours used to create that dollar value. In other words, how much are workers producing for each hour of their labor? Now you'll see that productivity has gone way up. Workers are producing a lot more for the companies that employ them, but their wages have not come anywhere near to keeping pace with that increase in productivity. Now finally, let's look at the gap here between the share of income going to the top 10% and union membership. As union membership goes down, the income inequality goes up, and the top 10% are getting a larger and larger share of the national wealth. So it touched 50%, for example, even as the union membership was in decline. Now, do unions raise wages? Yes. A study by the Economic Policy Institute shows that unions raise wages by 20% and total compensation, if you factor in benefits, by 28%. That's a significant difference. Non-union workers in largely unionized industries gain almost as much as union members. So if you work in an industry in which unions are important, you're going to gain even if you're not a member of that union or those unions. Other industries that don't have strong unions don't have similar increases. And even if an industry is only 25% unionized, a high school graduate is paid 5% more than in other industries. Now, how do they do that? How do they fight poverty? Well, for one thing, they level the playing field between workers and employers through collective bargaining. So employers, the CEOs, aren't making such an extreme difference between their compensation and what the workers are getting. They reduce inequality by raising the wages of the low-paid workers. They also create due process. That means if a company wants to fire a worker, they have grievance procedures, and they can challenge that through the power of their unions. They set patterns that help both union members and non-unionized workers. They set those patterns on wages, but also on hours. How many hours do they have to work? On overtime pay if they work more than the 40-hour week, on benefits, what they get for health care, for disability and unemployment insurance, for pensions, for vacation pay, for sick time, etc. All of those things have to be negotiated, and unions are very successful at improving those conditions. They also can improve working conditions, and that includes safety And work rules, like how many breaks do workers get? How fast does the assembly line move, etc. So unions really do help fight poverty. Now, they also bring dignity and community to workers. They improve the quality of their lives. They give them a group, a community that they can belong to. They increase the sense of pride that they have in their work.